like my previous speakers, I also always start with saying Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. I think for some of my non-Muslim colleagues that would be a little bit, oh, we don't usually do that. I usually do, but I don't say it out verbally. Even though Zach's just introduced me as being here as part of Cleveland Police's Independent Advisory Group, I'm also a governor here at the university, so I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the university, and Queen's Award winning university, and also start with an apology. As much as some of my kind of previous colleagues have actually mentioned that child sexual exploitation, child sexual abuse affects boys as well as girls, and perpetrators can also be women. My kind of presentation is very much focusing on women and girls, even though I totally accept it does happen. I think we're very, very far from addressing the issues of domestic violence in this country. We have 2 women who die each week at the hands of a current or former partner. For me, for a so-called civilized society, that's 2 women too many. A woman rings the police every minute of every day to report abuse. In order to try and explain who I am and what I do, most of the people here will think that's that strange woman from the council. But apart from the strange woman at the council, I do a lot of work with women across the region, including North East Women's Network, where we lobbied the UN in regards to CEDAW, and I bet absolutely nobody in this room has heard of CEDAW. Yeah, CEDAW is the United Nations Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's a human rights bill which is specifically for women, and it's the only one. And our government has signed up to that, and a lot of the issues that we're talking about today would be covered under that, as well as the UN rights for women, rights of the child. I'm also a member of Durham Women Rising, and again I think it was Zach who made the comment about 1 billion women in their lifetime will be affected by abuse, and that is the main focus of Durham Women Rising. It's part of an international campaign trying to raise people's awareness about those data and figures in terms of the impact. I was also a member of Cleveland Police's Operation Fibre Group, which looked at the local sexual abuse and grooming case that we've had recently. But that aside, I thought rather than just saying, well, I've done all this and this is my experience and knowledge, I thought it would be useful to ask some of my colleagues nationally about some of their experiences, because I think it's quite easy just to kind of Google and say, oh, these are the facts and figures. So I contacted colleagues ranging from Oxford who were involved in Operation Bullfinch, colleagues in London, Birmingham, Rotherham, Cardiff, Cumbria, Middlesbrough and Newcastle. And their professional background include a human rights barrister, social workers, community workers and community activists, a director of women's organisation, academics and a manager from a leading children's charity. And I asked them 3 main questions and thought, right, who or what is to blame for the recent increase, well, perception of recent increase of child sexual exploitation and grooming? What was your biggest fear or concern about this agenda, and how can we bring about positive change in order to address some of these issues? But before I go into that, I think, again, picking up points that colleagues have made earlier on, I think it's really important that we stress that child sexual exploitation is not confined to one community, either in terms of perpetrators or victims. I think it was, I've forgotten his surname, the ACPO lead, which is Association of Chief Police Officers lead for this agenda, I think last week kind of announced, I think it's 90% of child abuse happens within a familial setting. It's known to the, to the young person. It's not stranger danger. It's not these random gangs who are causing this. Yes, it does definitely happen, but it's such a huge issue, and I think what we're seeing is only a tiny, tiny tip of the iceberg, and we really need to get our head round. This is an issue that impacts on anybody and everybody, and I would more or less guarantee that we have survivors of abuse in this room and potentially perpetrators as well. And that's quite hard for people to hear and accept, but that is the reality of what we're dealing with here, and we really need to actually accept that. And despite the kind of high-profile coverage of Rochdale's you know, the ethnicity of the Rochdale perpetrators in 2013, 95% of the people who were on their sex offender register were white. And I think Bina again did point out that one of the guys who was the lead perpetrator in that gang was subsequently also sentenced for assaulting a young Asian woman. So, I mean, yes, there is an element of the BME community who abuse girls, maybe white girls, and not maybe, they definitely do, but they also abuse black and Asian women and girls as well. I think we really need to be careful that we don't kind of get everything out of context and just scapegoat one particular community, because I think there's a lot of work that people from that community and groups from that community are doing to bring about positive change. And also in terms of faith, yes, there are Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Sikh men and men from other communities and other faith communities and none who kind of believe that they're entitled to treat women in this way, and they have, you know, abused right across the board. But then at the same time, there's plenty of men from all those faith communities who haven't. So rather than just kind of saying it's just those people who do it, let's understand and accept all people do it. And how are we going to work together? Yeah, I think it was, the guy's name was Simon Bailey, who was the Chief Constable from Norfolk, who said 90% of child abuse takes place in the home. The other thing to get our head around is sexual abuse and exploitation is absolutely endemic in our society, and women and girls are socialised to actually accept the constraints and the limitations of their safety in space. I mean, how many guys in the room, every time you leave in the office, think, right, I need to have my car keys in my hand, not park in a particular place and whatever else, and just try and be safe. And for a woman and girls these days, there's so many challenges and things. I think the media just has this whole hype about, you know, it's certain types of victims. We need to move away from that. And for me, a huge issue is around the sexualisation of women and girls in all forms of media. I was at an event earlier on that some of my colleagues were at, and otherwise I would have gone home and changed into my normal page 3 t-shirt, because I think it's something we really need to do. And the worst thing is, I hear colleagues who kind of, you know, colleagues who I think, and friends who actually understand this agenda, and they will turn around and say, well, page 3 is quite harmless, it's nothing, you know, doesn't affect anybody. I used to look at it when I was a child and or a teenager, but it's just understanding how you then subsequently objectify women, and then men think, well, yeah, that's within our right to actually do that, and some of the impact on women and girls because of that. Basically, the social message that we get is that girls and women are valued for the way that they look, for their bodies and how sexually available they are, and this kind of contributes to that pervasive culture that we have. I think Rotherham showed that sexual grooming is just one element of the violence against women and girls, which is a problem right across globally and locally and whatever else. And the other issue for me is quite often the experiences and the voices of girls and women from minority groups aren't heard. And yes, you know, we've had the Muslim Women's Network report and a lot more people are paying attention, but I think it still quite often isn't recognised at a local level. It's not acknowledged, and more importantly, there isn't enough support for it. I think everything that everybody has said and all the research and everything shows is we have to work collaboratively, share responsibility, but also kind of share some of the resources. Alex J's report into child sexual exploitation, Rotherham found a lot and families were really reluctant to report when any of their young children were missing, because of that whole shame and cultural barriers in terms of once everybody finds out, it's again the victim is seen as the one who's done something wrong. You know, it's again that classic thing that we have around rape culture. Why was she dressed like that? Why was she drunk? I mean, the whole thing with that footballer guy is bringing it all back again now. The focus is, a lot of focus is on the victim having to take the blame. You put yourself into that situation. And time again, I think there's been lots of evidence where victims have been failed by the very people who were supposed to support them and provide that care, whether they were the police and, you know, or local authorities and whatever else. And I think there's been lots of talk around kind of multiculturalism being the reason that a lot of these attitudes and cases weren't dealt with. In kind of the questions that I put to a lot of my colleagues a lot of issues came back, and there were comments about not necessarily multiculturalism, but perhaps some post-colonial guilt, if not arrogance, where you haven't taken seriously the allegations of some of the victims, but also the concern that's been brought to the attention of service providers by some of the women's organisations and some of the African minority community themselves. As somebody who's been kind of working on this agenda, I know some of the women's groups in Rotherham, I know some of the women's groups in Oxford, and let me tell you this, the authorities knew this was going on. Well, some of it, I think, is linked to this whole speaking to the so-called self-appointed and self-anointed community leaders. They're not community leaders. Go out there and speak to the real people who actually know what is going on. But in order to do that, I think you have to have those levels of trust, but also have the adequate services in place. It's no use going out there and offering to listen and ask questions if we don't have the resources in place, or the appropriate resources in place. When I asked people who was to blame, it was very much a case of, it was a societal issue that we all need to take responsibility for, and we all need to work together to make sure that we support victims, especially within the BME communities, to kind of stop shaming and naming people and saying this is your fault, this is why what's happened to you. The biggest worry about the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse of children was that lessons will not be learned. We will continue to have the U-Tree, Operation Bullfinch, Operation Fibre, and all these different things where we keep reinventing the wheel and we're never moving forward. Basically, we have to change our attitude and actually understand the impact and the challenge of social media. I mean, it was fantastic that the government are now talking about a law around revenge porn, which I really struggle with as a term. Because, again, within our community, I think there's been lots and lots of cases where people get into relationships or friendships and photographs are taken, and then that whole blackmail thing. I recently had to organise some social media training for a community group, and Yapa, who's one of my colleagues, came up with a very good point to people in terms of social media. She said, if you wouldn't want your boss or your grandmother or the police to see it, don't put it on Facebook or anywhere else. And it's the same thing with photographs and everything else. In order to address the issue, it was very important that we address the fundamental inequalities rooted in gender differences right across society. And our responses must be really robust to protect all excuse me, all our children, irrespective of whether we think that the relationship is consensual. Again, I think we need to create more spaces where young people feel safe and can disclose stuff, and especially for me, I think we need more women-only spaces where you can actually listen and talk. And ultimately, we need to focus on justice for victims rather than the ethnicity of the perpetrators. The voices and justice for the victims seems to have got lost in all of this, as well as the fact that we need to think about the diversity of all our communities. And also, I think it's really important that sexual abuse and sexual exploitation is just one level of the continuum of violence against girls and women. And I think the government's very keen on kind of concentrating on exotic forms of abuse, whether it's FGM or honour-based violence, but I think it has to have very much a broad brush kind of view. I'm sorry, it's been very much a whistle-stop tour as with everybody else, but for me it's very much about challenging attitudes right across the board and understanding our communities and providing appropriate, relevant services for all. Thank you.